Alright guys, what's up? You're watching Claritone Audio. I'm NaiLiK. So today's video we're going to be looking at using dynamic EQ to control harshness and leads when you might have some kind of cutoff automation that's changing the high frequency information, or maybe some note changes. And we're also going to look at using pitch tracking EQ to control note changes on our bass line without kind of having our volume jump up and down drastically. So it's going to really help us improve these two kind of problematic areas. And there's two different ways that we can attack similar issues. So we're going to hop right into Cubase. We'll take a look at dynamic EQ using Fabfilter Pro-Q3, and pitch tracking EQ, we're going to be using Surfer EQ. So without further ado, we'll jump right into the video. And I hope you guys enjoy it. Be sure to drop any questions or future video requests down below. And if you guys like the content, give this video a like and drop me a subscribe. Alright guys, so today we're going to be looking at two less popular EQ techniques that are really useful when they're applied in the right way to solve some issues that you might be having. So we're going to be looking at using dynamic EQ and pitch tracking EQ to solve some problems. Maybe when you have some filter automation or some note changes in either your bass lines or your leads that cause your high frequency information to go kind of out of whack at some point, but not all the time. So you don't want to just apply a regular EQ cut, which is just static and always cutting. You want it to only cut when maybe the high frequency rises to a certain point, or like I said, when you have maybe a note change which causes there to be a big jump in high frequencies because maybe the lower notes didn't have as much. So the first thing we'll look at is using dynamic EQ, and we're going to be using Fabfilter Pro-Q3. So if we open this thing, and before I start to use it, I'm just going to show you what we're dealing with, which is a kind of arpeggiated lead which has a filter automation. And there's not a lot of high frequency information, but as the filter rises, it goes kind of crazy and it gets really harsh, and we don't want that. So we don't want to just cut it all the time. We want to use a dynamic EQ. So let's listen to what it sounds like before, and then I'll show you how we can set that up in Pro-Q3. So you can see right in the end that high frequency jumps right up, and it kind of wasn't there the whole time throughout the lead was playing. So this is only like an 8-bar loop, but let's say we had that playing, and then right at the end of whatever length of time, you had a filter automation going up. So you're going to want to use a dynamic EQ to control that, and Pro-Q3 has dynamic EQ built right in. So we're going to make a bell. We're going to dip this high frequency maybe around 15K, and obviously it's going to the left and to the right of that center frequency. We can adjust our Q a little bit. So generally if we just do a cut, it's going to be static and it'll be applied all the time. So we're going to leave that at 0. And if we reach for this outer band outside of the regular gain of that EQ band, we have the dynamic control. So we can set that to either dynamically cut or dynamically boost. And what that's going to do is it's going to use a threshold. So whenever the signal level of the frequencies in that band passes above or below the threshold, depending on if you're boosting or cutting, however you want to talk about it, it's going to either boost or cut by this amount. So I'll just close that by this amount here. So we're going to go with a cut amount of, let's say, 3 dB approximately. And by default, Fabfilter applies a basic threshold, which is generally pretty good, but sometimes you're going to want to turn that off from auto mode. So you just click the auto button above, and then we can see it displays this little slider above the above a little meter here. So we're going to listen again, and we'll set our threshold so that it goes to boost kind of close to that full 3 dB range when it gets the harshest at the top here. So we're going to start it halfway through, and we'll just see what it's doing at this level right now. Okay, so if we listen to it right at the beginning, we can see that the band is not activated. It's not doing any cutting here. It's just barely jiggling, but it's not cutting. And then as we get into the second half here, we get to the full range of the cut at the second half there, just as we wanted. So we can increase the amount that it cuts by or decrease it by just adjusting that red ring, and we don't have to change the threshold amount. And I'll just bypass that and we'll listen before and after, and we'll hear the difference of what that did for us. So here's in bypass. And now we'll listen to that again with it enabled. And now what I'll do is I'll have it enabled and then I'll disable it halfway through so we can hear the high frequencies come back through a little bit better. So did you hear it right at the end when I clicked it off? You get that kind of harsh airiness back that we don't want. And of course we can use this on a wider range of the high frequency information too. Maybe if we wanted to drop that down a little bit here. So that'll help us keep our leads nice and smooth and remove any harshness. So we can use this on also bass lines. If, for example, you wanted to kind of dynamically cut them certain areas, and then as you have a filtering part, whatever, it might increase the amount that it's cutting. Because you can also use, an important thing to note is we can also use the static cut in conjunction with the dynamic cut, or the dynamic part of the EQ. So we can have a static cut of maybe 1 or 2 dB, and then we can have an extended range of 3 dB using the dynamic part of the EQ. So that's something we can do with bass lines, maybe if we had a filtering part where you had a general cut, but in the filtering part you wanted to make sure that nothing gets out of whack. You add the dynamic band to use on top of the static cut that you have. Next we'll look at this bass line. So I just kind of bypassed what I had. So we had this EQ cutting the second and fourth harmonic, and then we have this little kind of mid-range dip and these two cuts in the bass to deal with some of that sub information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bypass both of those, and we're going to put our Surfer EQ on. And this is a pitch tracking EQ. So I've added a little bass groove into the second half of the bar, but to set up our EQ, we'll just listen to it on the root note of our track, or the root note of our track. So I'll solo that out, and then I'll set up similar cuts to what I had going in the 2 Pro Q3s that I bypassed, and then we'll listen to how they, or see what happens as we get the bass note changes, and we have it in surf mode for each band. Okay, so let's just keep it simple for simplicity's sake here, just to kind of speed it up here. So actually, maybe I'll just add that little dip. Let's check the frequency. So I was dipping around 330. So obviously it's going to sound quite different because, as we can see, we don't have as narrow of a Q for the settings on our bands here. Even if at the most narrow setting, they don't get anywhere near as narrow and precise as Pro Q3. So we'll just kind of compare what the sound was before and what the sound is with Surfer EQ, just to see how close we can get with this actual EQ. Okay, so I feel like that's a little more similar sounding. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to So I just realized I did that kind of wrong. So I'm going to turn on the surf mode, but I'll just remember the frequency. So we're at 193. So if I put that in surf, and we'll just move that over to 193. We're at 335, so we'll put that there. And then we'll move our band to close enough. And then here we were at 115, and then we're still at 115. So now we've got them in surf mode. So cool, we've got the same sound and everything is cool. But if we go back to our Fabfilter, we'll listen to the problem first. So as we get the bass groove or the bass note changes, we can clearly see here on this analyzer that as we get to this part here at bar 3, the spectrum is going to change completely, and our EQ obviously remains for the first notes. Right, so we don't get anything, we get these big boosts in volume, and obviously the frequency is related to that. So if we go to Surfer EQ and we listen to it now, as it changes the notes, our EQ and all of our cuts are actually going to move up and down with the different notes that are played. So maybe this third band here, we don't want it to surf because it's kind of cutting a little bit too high in the frequency. So we'll listen to it again. So now let's compare that with Pro-Q3 and how it doesn't move, and we can see that we get these big jumps in volume, and that sorts it out using the pitch tracking EQ. So that's two ways that you're going to want to use dynamic EQ and pitch tracking EQ to fix these issues with harshness and different notes causing different frequency issues. So we'll just quickly take a look at this lead here, which is the sample and hold lead we did in one of my first videos, and we'll clean it up with dynamic EQ. And now without. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you guys are going to apply these techniques to help you out with your issues, solve harshness. And if you guys are some of the producers that are using those moving bass lines, this will hopefully help you out and simplify the process so you don't have to maybe, I know sometimes when you have different notes, maybe you're separating channels and applying different EQ settings just to avoid this. So if you download Surfer EQ or any other pitch tracking EQ, I believe there's one by Melta Productions or probably some other ones out there that I'm not aware of. That's how you can solve that issue and keep your bass line all in one MIDI channel and apply the appropriate EQ depending on which note is playing. So if you guys like that one, drop me a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching Claritone Audio.